For years, the global economy revolved around a handful of power players: the United States, China, and the European Union. But in 2025, something changed. One country, once seen as a rising star but always playing catch-up, was now on a fast track to becoming an economic superpower. And the reason? Donald Trump. When Trump returned to the White House in 2025, the world braced for impact.
The golden age of America begins right now. I will declare a national emergency at our southern border.
His policies were aggressive, unpredictable, and unapologetically America first. But while some countries struggled under the weight of his decisions, one country stood to gain more than anyone else: India. Because Trump's trade war with China, it wasn't just about punishing Beijing. It was about redirecting power. And India was perfectly positioned to take everything China was losing. Under Trump, the US ramped up tariffs, sanctions, and restrictions on Chinese goods. Tech companies pulled out. Major US firms could no longer rely on China's factories. Manufacturing moved elsewhere. Decades of supply chains built around China were breaking apart. Investors got nervous. China's once booming economy was now facing slowing growth, capital flight, and uncertainty. And as American businesses looked for a new home, India was waiting with open arms. Lower labor costs. Indian wages were still lower than China's, making it a prime destination for manufacturing. A massive workforce. With over 1.4 billion people, India had the labor supply to absorb major industries. Pro-business leadership. Prime Minister Narendra Modi had spent years preparing India to be the next global hub, and now the opportunity had arrived. But it wasn't just about economics. Trump saw India as a strategic weapon. China wasn't just an economic competitor, it was America's biggest geopolitical rival. And in Trump's world, if you're fighting an enemy, you need allies. So the US did something it had never done before. It backed India fully. Trade deals were rewritten. India was given preferential access to US markets. Tech partnerships exploded. American companies, blocked from China, flooded into India. Military ties deepened. The US and India strengthened defense agreements, building a united front against China. And the result? India wasn't just growing, it was transforming. A decade ago, China was the default answer for cheap labor, manufacturing, and global supply chains. But now, India was taking its place. And for the first time, the world was seeing a new economic superpower emerge. But this was just the beginning, because the real question wasn't just how fast India was rising, it was how much China was about to lose. For decades, China had been the factory of the world. If a product had a Made in China label, it meant efficiency, scale, and dominance. But in 2025, that era was coming to an end. And the reason? Donald Trump's America had shut the door. Trump's return to power wasn't just a repeat of his first presidency. It was a full-scale economic war. Tariffs on Chinese goods soared to record highs. Imports became too expensive for American businesses. Technology bans expanded. US firms were forbidden from working with Chinese manufacturers, cutting Beijing out of critical industries. Supply chains broke down. Without access to Western markets, Chinese exports collapsed. For China, the impact was catastrophic. Foreign investment plummeted. International businesses didn't want to deal with uncertainty, so they moved their money elsewhere. Factories shut down. With fewer international buyers, China's once booming industrial zones started to slow. The real estate crisis deepened. Years of reckless borrowing and overbuilding had left China drowning in debt. Now, with its economy shrinking, the cracks were turning into fractures. For years, China had seemed unstoppable, but now it was losing its grip. And the country standing by, ready to take its place? India. As China's economy stumbled, India was stepping up. Manufacturing giants shifted production. Apple, Tesla, Samsung all started moving operations from China to India. Silicon Valley turned to Bangalore. With China locked out of the US tech industry, India's booming IT sector became the new favourite. Western capital flowed in. American and European investors, once focused on China, poured billions into Indian markets instead. And Trump? He made sure the transition was permanent. New trade deals favoured India over China. American companies were given tax incentives to set up factories in India. Defence ties grew stronger. The US sold India advanced military technology, cementing its role as Washington's key ally in Asia. India's infrastructure boom began, with new foreign investment. Highways, rail networks, and tech hubs expanded at a pace never seen before. In just a few years, India went from an emerging economy to the world's fastest growing industrial power. And for China, the nightmare was only getting worse. Because for the first time in decades, it wasn't just losing business, it was losing influence. And when a superpower starts losing control, desperation sets in. Which is exactly what happened next. China had spent decades building its global dominance. It wasn't going to let it all slip away without a fight. As Trump's policies crushed China's economy, Beijing had two choices: adapt, open up its markets, make peace with the US, and try to regain trust; fight back, double down on its power moves, tighten control, and make America regret its decisions. China chose the second option. Beijing's response to Trump's trade war was swift and aggressive. It cut off rare earth metal exports. These are critical for everything from smartphones to military equipment. Over 80% of the world's supply came from China. Now, they were shutting down supply chains overnight. It launched a global price war. To keep its factories running, China began selling its products below market value, flooding global markets with cheap goods. It tightened ties with Russia, Iran, and other US adversaries. If the West couldn't buy from China, China would build its own economic alliances. But none of it was enough. Trump's America had anticipated China's moves, and India was ready to take advantage. Rare earth metal production ramped up in India. With US funding, India quickly expanded its own mining operations, becoming a new supplier for Western tech companies. China's price war hurt itself more than the US. Companies weren't rushing back to China, they had already relocated. India filled the void in global supply chains. As China isolated itself, India stepped up as the new industrial leader. The harder China fought to reclaim its dominance, the more it pushed investors, companies, and allies straight into India's arms. By late 2025, the numbers told the real story. Foreign investment in China had dropped by 40%. Meanwhile, India saw record-breaking growth. China's GDP growth slowed to historic lows, while India's economy was growing at over 7% per year. Manufacturing jobs were vanishing in China and exploding in India. For the first time in decades, China wasn't the future of global industry. India was. And the one person responsible for accelerating that shift? Donald Trump. But this wasn't just about business. Because when an economic giant starts falling, the geopolitical balance of the world starts shifting. And what came next was even bigger than anyone expected. For decades, people assumed that China would be the undisputed economic leader of the future. But by 2025, that prediction had changed. India was no longer just a rising economy. it was now a global powerhouse. And the biggest irony, it was Donald Trump, one of the most unpredictable leaders in history, who had set the stage for India's greatest economic boom. With China locked out of Western markets, India became the natural replacement. Silicon Valley moved its tech production to India. Apple, Google, and Microsoft expanded operations in Bangalore, Hyderabad, and Pune. Tesla opened its first major Indian factory, signaling the shift of high-tech manufacturing from China to India. Pharmaceutical giants built research hubs in India, making it the go-to destination for medicine and biotech. And unlike China, India wasn't just a cheap labor hub anymore. It was becoming a leader in innovation. Indian engineers were designing the world's next-generation AI systems. Indian companies were producing their own electric vehicles, competing with the biggest brands. Indian startups were attracting record-breaking foreign investment, rivaling Silicon Valley itself. For years, India had been treated as an outsourcing destination, a place for call centers and IT support. Now, it was creating the future. Trump didn't just see India as an economic partner, he saw it as a strategic ally. US-India military cooperation reached new levels. With China becoming more aggressive in the South China Sea, Washington deepened its defense ties with New Delhi. A new economic bloc was forming. The US, India, Japan, and Australia strengthened their trade and security agreements, cutting China out of the equation. Western universities partnered with Indian institutions, fueling a new wave of world-class engineers, scientists, and entrepreneurs. For the first time, India wasn't just benefiting from Western investment, it was shaping global trade and technology. And in the process, it had cemented its place as the next great economic superpower. While China still remained a major player, its dominance was over. Western companies were no longer dependent on Beijing. China's economy was slowing, while India's was accelerating. For the first time in modern history, India's economic future looked brighter than China's. No one could have predicted that Donald Trump, one of the most controversial figures in modern history, would be responsible for the biggest economic shift in decades. But his aggressive trade war, his strategic partnership with India, and his deep distrust of China had reshaped the global economy. And now, the world was watching. Because while China struggled to recover, India was just getting started. The future of the global economy? It no longer belonged to Beijing. It belonged to New Delhi. If you found this breakdown insightful, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more deep dives into global power shifts. What do you think? Is India truly the next economic superpower? Or does China still have a few tricks up its sleeve? Let's discuss in the comments below. And as always, thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.